Hello, and welcome back to Atomic Blast, the supplemental podcast where we analyze each chapter of Legendary's MonsterVerse. My name is Mark, and you can find me on all social media at Mark Meadows. Today, we will be analyzing and providing commentary for the second chapter of Gareth Edwards' Godzilla. Today's chapter will cover the Janjira Power Plant meltdown, and then we will flash forward 15 years later. But before we begin with today's chapter, I want to talk a little bit about the surname for the Brody family. Now, it's no mystery that Edwards was channeling his inner Spielberg when directing Godzilla, but Max Borenstein also included a reference to Jaws when naming the main characters. In an interview, Gareth Edwards said the following: "For a while there was this idea that Bryan Cranston's character had this dilemma about shutting the power plant down, but he had a lot of pressure on him to not do that. Some of that got lost in the development of the screenplay, but we always said he's like Brody in Jaws, so we always referred to him like that. Eventually, Max Borenstein went, f it, I'm going to call him Brody."
The Muto, still in lava form, travelled to Japan, where it burrowed beneath the Janjira nuclear facility, collapsing the structure foundation and causing a reactor breach.
Chapter 2 will begin with an establishing shot of the Janjira Power Plant as Joseph Brody and Sandra Brody investigate the tremors immediately upon arriving. The Art of Destruction book details that the nuclear facility was stitched together using several locations. The exterior was an industrial space in the Vancouver area, which was a riverfront pulp and paper mill that had been closed and abandoned for years. For the interior shots, an existing water treatment plant was chosen and deemed perfect by the art department for its long tunnels, stainless steel pipes, and concrete floors. The control room for the facility was built by the set designers and was the most challenging part of the sequence. Filming only took place for a few days, but the construction of the control room had taken a few months to complete. The accuracy needed for this control room demanded that the set resemble a Japanese nuclear facility dating back to 1999. Set director Elizabeth Wilcox explains that every console, computer screen, and even paperwork had to be correctly labeled in Japanese. The control room was not big enough to have traditional set lighting, so it required light sources from within the set, such as fluorescent light bulbs that could change from white to red during the crisis. As Joseph Brody gets to work, we see him joined by his close friend and colleague Stan Walsh, played by Gary Chalk. Stan Walsh is another transplanted American like Joseph Brody, and as they head towards the control room, they are both updated about the anomaly by nuclear engineer Sachio Maki. Meanwhile, Sandra Brody and her team of engineers begin their descent underneath the core reactor building. Already in contrast to many Godzilla films prior, this film draws the audience into caring about the main characters because there's this sense of urgency as the nuclear facility expects a potential meltdown. In terms of storytelling and filmmaking, what's known as the walk and talk technique is used in Joseph Brody's scene and is very effective because it invokes a sense of panic and that time is running out for a solution. With Juliette Binoche's character Sandra, we get to see a very cool 360 camera shot revolve around her as she prepares her team. Although this is a less frantic shot than the walk and talk, it still generates suspense and that something threatening will soon happen. And sure enough, something threatening does happen. The male Muto reaches the nuclear facility, causing an eruption and releasing radiation into the subcorridors of the reactor building. Joseph runs off to secure Sandra and her team, and with the music arrangement enhancing the scene, we observe one of the many great performances by Bryan Cranston in the film. There's so much to love about this final scene in Janjira, but the best part has to be the performance that Bryan Cranston delivers. In regards to his talent, Gareth Edwards has said that Bryan Cranston has a ton of experience and can hit his mark and do exactly the same thing with as much emotion each take. We'd have these really intense scenes where Bryan would be in tears, and at the end of a take, you would think he'd take half an hour to come down, but he'd crack a joke instead. The eruption of nuclear radiation becomes its own terrifying monster in this scene, since we still do not see the male Muto until later in the film. This cloud of radiation that chases after Sandra and her team comes off more as an element of the horror genre than it does science fiction or adventure film. Of course, more recently with HBO's miniseries Chernobyl, we were not only reminded of the 1986 incident in Pripyat, but it too illustrated this chemical disaster as a living monster. If you have not seen it yet and enjoy the content of this scene in Godzilla, I highly recommend checking out HBO's Chernobyl as well. And of course, we have the 2012 nuclear incident in Japan's own Fukushima prefecture, which was even more influential to the events of this film. Across the river from the Janjira Power Plant is the school that Ford Brody is attending. We can see that the children are studying butterflies, and located on the poster behind the school teacher, we can see that there's an illustration of the butterfly that closely resembles the iconic Mothra. As Ford Brody witnesses the collapse of the Janjira plant, the camera pans to include Ford's classroom window display, framing the destruction with dinosaurs and flying cranes in a nod to future events of the film.
In the short time since, the Muto hatchling has already formed a cocoon-like structure about itself and the breached reactor. Thus far, this has resulted in near-perfect containment of the meltdown. Please review Dr. Serazawa's research on how the Muto is absorbing radiation to familiarize yourself with our current data.
15 years later, we arrive at present day of our story. Ford Brody returns to his home in San Francisco after 14 months of active duty in Afghanistan. Upon arriving, Ford reconnects with his family, his wife and his son. Ford's wife, Elle, is played by Elizabeth Olsen, and Ford's son, Sam, is played by Carson Bold. In the novelization, the arrival of Ford Brody is extended to reveal the awkward reconnection between him and his son, Sam. Although Elle tries to ease the situation, Sam is illustrated as being shy and hesitant to embrace his father. Ford thinks about how it is easier for him to deal with disarming explosive devices than it is to emotionally reconnect with his family. My commentary for this excluded scene is that I would have loved to seen it as an extra on the home release, but I'm okay with it not being included on the final cut of the film. Yes, it adds character development to the Brody family by defining each of their behaviors, but ultimately is not necessary in telling the story. The story is about mankind encountering Godzilla, and Ford Brody is our pair of eyes for that experience. In the final scene of this chapter, once Sam is tucked into bed, and before things get too intimate between Ford and Elle, Ford receives a call from Japan that his father Joseph has been arrested for trying to infiltrate the quarantine zone of Janjira. At first, Ford tries to reject the call to help his father, stating that his father is putting his family at risk. Elle counters Ford's dismissal, defending that his father is also his family. Ford, although infuriated at the situation, begins packing in a rush to get to the airport. What we're shown here, besides the story's call to adventure, is somewhat of a contrast in how Ford feels about his family. Ford struggles to reconnect with his immediate family, and yet chooses not to reconnect with his father. He wants to be with Elle and Sam, but needs to be with Joseph. Even if we do not appreciate him for his actions, Ford coming to terms with that and doing the right thing is what makes him an ethical protagonist instead of just a logical one. And that about does it for today's episode of Atomic Blast. If you have any questions or want to discuss any and all things Godzilla, you can find Atomic Blast on Twitter at Atomic Blast Pod, or me personally at Mark Meadows on all social media. And if you enjoyed everything you've heard today and want to show your appreciation, consider leaving a positive review or tell your friends about the show. With all that said, I hope you check out the next episode, and I will see you then.